So I guess this will serve as that response to Sargon's Why Women Should Reject Cuckoldry video that he put out a week ago, or whatever it was. And because this is going to be more of a rambly video of my own thoughts on the matter, as well as, I guess, following the natural conclusions of some of this logic, I think it's probably important to point out that I don't actually do any of the stuff that we're going to talk about today personally. I definitely don't want that sword hanging over my head. In fact, the joke that I like to indulge in is that I'm not an incel and I'm not a volcel. I'm actually an involuntary incelibate, meaning that I have a girlfriend that I have sex with, but I don't actually want to be having sex. It's not quite the truth, but, you know, you can see the funny in that. Anyway, I know that this wasn't part of Sargon's video or his argument, but I do want to put it out there. Just as a surface layer analysis, I don't think the government should have any involvement in this, even though I think cucking is probably really bad in like 99% of cases. There are 0% of cases where the state should step in and enforce that morality on you. We're still individuals, we still have rights, and people should be able to do what they like. That includes sexually, and that includes if it completely destroys themselves or their relationships. That's a personal issue. It's between them and their spouse, maybe their family, maybe their religion. It has nothing to do with the state. Now, Sargon spends most of his video talking about what seems to be like one-sided cuckoldry, right? So we're talking situations where the guy is completely fine with his wife going off to fuck other dudes behind his back as long as she comes home to him. You know, the destiny cuckoldry. And presumably, in these relationships, it actually goes both ways. But I mean, come on, Destiny's not getting nearly as much action as his woman is he? Let's be honest. So even when on paper, the openness of the relationship goes both ways, in practice it usually only goes one way. And if you're really unlucky, then on paper it only goes one way. Of course, the obvious question here is it cuckoldry every single time a person in a relationship has sex with somebody outside of that relationship? And then you have to think, well, are there instances where it's not? And I guess the one that comes to mind first and foremost is threesomes, right? So for example, if you're completely devoted to your partner and your partner's completely devoted to you, and the only time another person is involved in the relationship sexually is if you're both involved in that other person. So yeah, you might fuck somebody else, but only while your wife is involved in the fucking, and she might fuck somebody else, but only while you're involved in the fucking because it's a threesome. Is that cuckoldry? You know, probably not. It's up in the air whether or not it's healthy for a long-term relationship. It probably can be if the parties involved are mature enough, but of course that's a pretty high requirement nowadays, isn't it? But no, I don't think anybody who is involved in like a threesome situation, I don't think anyone views that as cucking. Okay, well, how about this? When you look at, say, a pimp and a prostitute, no one views the pimp as a cuck, right? I mean, it's not the same kind of relationship as a husband and a wife or a boyfriend and a girlfriend. And it's not a positive relationship, usually, but there can still be a sexual aspect to it. So here's what I mean. Let's say you have a pimp who has sex with one of his prostitutes regularly. There's still a sexual, physical relationship there. And yet, that prostitute still goes out and has sex with other men. Nobody views the pimp as a cuck, even though she's fucking other guys without him. And I really do think that the whole cuck thing comes not only from sexual activity, but also from loss of control. And I think that's why a lot of guys do it. You have a lot of beta males who don't want to be dominant in their relationship. And I don't mean like strictly BDSM, dominant, submissive lifestyle stuff. I just mean, you know, taking charge in your average day-to-day situation. You have a lot of beta males who don't want to do that. And so they kind of have the open relationship where either party is technically allowed to go out and have sex with other people. That's kind of their excuse to do what they think is indulging in their loss of control fantasy or their humiliation fantasy, you know? But with the pimp-prostitute dynamic, the pimp never actually gives up his dominance in that relationship, even though the woman's going around having sex with other people. She quite literally does come back to him every time. And I think it's because the sexual activity happens on his say-so. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say a lot of the times the woman is forced into it. But nonetheless, it's what he wants, and so what he wants takes priority over what she wants in that situation. With the pimp, it's very much a, you will have sex with who I want you to have sex with, and you'll do it when I want, you'll do it how I want, you'll do it who I want you to do it with, and if I say stop, it stops. That's what it seems like to me anyway. And I think a lot of beta males who enjoy cuckoldry, they might be deluding themselves that they're in that kind of position, that they have that kind of control, But, what happens every single time they try to close their relationship again? When they try to go back to monogamy, what usually happens? The woman either says no, or she cheats on him, or she leaves him. Sometimes all three of those things. So he never had the control to begin with, and he was basically just deluding himself that he did. But those two dynamics, the swinger woman with the cuck husband and the pimp prostitute, they're basically two sides of the same coin, where one party has all of the dominance and control of the relationship. When it's a cuck situation, all of the sex that she engages with outside of the relationship happens entirely by her will, and despite how they might delude themselves, none of his will. Meanwhile, on the flip side, with the pimp-prostitute situation, all of the sex that she engages with outside of the relationship happens entirely on his will and not hers. And I would go so far to say as both relationships are probably equally unhealthy, because, yeah, I know that most relationships eventually naturally order themselves into the more dominant and more submissive partners. Again, not talking lifestyle, just talking everyday occurrences. But if that control is in 100% in one person's camp and 0% in the other, it inevitably leads to the collapse of the relationship. Because even the most submissive people still need some kind of self-determination. At the very least, to function outside of the relationship, they need that. So your average healthy relationship, consisting of a typical somewhat dominant man and a typical somewhat submissive woman, will probably have a division of control something along the lines of 60-40 or something. Certainly not 100-0. And I really do think that you can look at a man who gives up all of the control and is living happily in this one-sided cuck relationship with the same moral disdain that you would look at a pimp with his prostitutes. Now, of course, there's also the consent argument. There will be a lot of sex-negative feminists who say that prostitution is inherently exploitative and that no woman ever consents to that. Or they also say this about porn. No woman ever consents to going into porn. That's just ludicrous. But also, if we're talking about your long-term health, I'm not sure if consent is a factor. It is in terms of rights, obviously, but not in terms of health. You can consent to smoking and still die of lung cancer. That doesn't mean that the state should ban smoking, but it means that you should think long and hard about whether or not you want to be smoking. And the same goes with this kind of stuff. People consent to staying in all types of abusive relationships all the time. They have to come to their own moral convictions and gain the courage to leave. That can't be forced on them by anybody else. And you can kind of feel the same way about fetishes, right? Like, I recall reading a story on Reddit recently where there was a dude who just loved getting kicked in the balls, like, as hard as you could. So he would hire prostitutes to go and, like, hold him down or strap him down or whatever it would be, and then just put on these heels, I think it was. Either heels or boots, I'm not sure, whichever one hurt more, I guess, and just kick him as hard as they could in the balls. And all the while, he'd be screaming things like, "Sterilize me, mommy," or something. And then finally, when he came from it, and that's all it took, he didn't have to really touch him other than kick him, and he would come. But finally, after he came, he would lie there crying, after the haze of sex had lifted, crying about how he didn't actually want to be sterilized. Which is, a really sad story when you think about it after you get over laughing a little bit at the absurdity of it. And, I think that's something, not necessarily that extreme, but that's something that we can all kind of relate to. Have you ever watched a porn and then after you were done been like, oh, why did I watch this? Like, this is actually kind of disgusting. This is a bit too far even for me. Or when you, like, bring home that girl that you thought was a lot hotter and then, like, the next morning after you're no longer drunk, you're like, oh. I think we all have an experience like that where once we're no longer interested in sex, some of the things that we can remember ourselves doing, they disgust us. And I think that we know on some level that there's a variety of self-destructive sexual impulses. And this idea that cuckoldry is somehow not one of them just seems ridiculous to me. The progressive notion of sex right now it's quite strange, at least to me. They have these conflicting rules where they think that, on the one hand, sex is universally good. It's fun. It's healthy psychologically. People should be able to have all the sex that they want with whomever they want, as much as they can, with no negative consequences. Because people who can't stop themselves from forming emotional attachments, they're just babies, need to grow up. And that old prohibitions about sex are simply religious in nature and have no place in the modern world. And if you object on the grounds of, say, STDs, you're just being a bigot in that regards, because now you're AIDS phobic or something stupid. But at least all that stuff packaged together is a consistent philosophy, but then they pair it with a completely inconsistent philosophy, which is the philosophy of enthusiastic consent, where even though sex was so liberating and amazing and free and open in the previous instance, it's also so hyper dangerous that you have to have consent forms, and you have to have your partner say yes every 15 seconds. And if you're both drunk, then you've raped each other. And that having someone hit on you that you didn't want, or even having someone look at you that you didn't want, is as serious as sexual assault. These two worldviews, they don't mesh. And yet that is the combined narrative that progressives on the left are pushing right now when it comes to human sexuality. And I think that's why at least a lot of the male feminists can conceptualize cuckoldry as being freeing, even when it's actually damaging. Sargon also makes the point that it's bad for the woman, and I hope I have his point right here, because basically, as you do things, your tastes over time change. So even if, she's not into it in the start, but he is, and he really wants to get cucked, and over time she changes to enjoy it more, and then, after the inevitable collapse of the relationship, where does she go from there? A similar thing is a lot of porn addicts, they often report that the porn got more extreme over time, because the old stuff just wasn't cutting it for them anymore. And there's definitely like this escalation of degeneracy almost, where people try more and more extreme things because they're currently not satisfied, and it becomes this cycle where nothing satisfies them, so they just keep going deeper and deeper down that hole. And I think this is the root of the conservative idea that women who have too much sex with too many men are emotionally damaged. There's probably some truth to that, and I know that those same conservatives don't want to hear this, but it's probably pretty similar for men who have too much sex as well. Let's go back to the original question. Are there instances where cucking would actually work? And, I mean, if there is, it has to be a minority, doesn't it? I think a lot of people fool themselves into thinking that it'll work, but, probably not. I recently finished up, a few months ago or whatever, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And in Crime and Punishment, what sets the events in motion in the story is that you have Rodion Raskolnikov, who is this brilliant, progressive young member of Russian society, who believes that his fierce intellect basically allows him to craft his own moral code. What I mean by that is, rather than avoiding things that, the old way, the ancient religions of humanity said were immoral, he could commit those acts that his culture thought to be immoral as long as he had a good enough reason, as well as a strong enough force of will to basically withstand the impact on himself and his psyche and the culture around him. What that means in practical terms is that Raskolnikov is a good man, and he's faced with a problem. His family needs money for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of human suffering involved. And he knows an old woman who is an absolutely terrible human being by every possible metric, who has a lot of money and is simply hoarding it. This is a woman that, if she were to suddenly vanish one day, would not be missed by anyone, and the money could be put to greater use in the service of Raskolnikov's family. So he plans the perfect crime. He murders her, he takes the money, and he gets away with it, at least legally. But that's just the start of the story, and the rest of the book describes basically his descent into insanity, as the guilt of that action basically eats him from the inside. And his initial thesis was, I'm obviously good. She's obviously evil. As long as I do it with good intentions, I can take what I want from her and do what I like to her because she deserves it, in the service of helping other people. And I can handle it, I'm morally superior, everything will be fine. But that's not how human beings are. We can't really craft our own morality. We can to a limited extent, I think, but not to that point. And I think the vast majority of people who say, oh, we're mature enough to handle cucking, they're probably thinking along the same lines as that. It's obviously not quite as serious, it's not a murder, it's just sexual infidelity, but nonetheless, it's the same thought process. It's that, oh, this doesn't work for other people, but I'm of a different caliber than they are. That's their thought processes. And it never works for them, because they're not nearly as high and mighty as they think. You almost have to have some kind of superiority complex to actually think that you could do this brazenly and wantonly and not completely destroy your life. But then the other argument, the counter-argument to that, is like the magic mushrooms argument. It's well known now to the people who have been studying drugs in the States, if you give a person mushrooms or some other drugs, I don't remember the exact list, and they have a positive trip, their outlook on life changes. Their personality changes to an extent. Almost as if they've had a monumental religious experience and they've converted to some kind of new faith, and they've turned their life around, and they've, things have completely changed for them because some core event, some seminal event happened to them, and they decided to get themselves together. You can almost induce that experience using drugs. Not reliably, not consistently, but reliably and consistently enough that many psychologists, back in the 60s and 70s, started to take notice. And you could make the argument that even though drugs are generally bad for you, and most people will fall into addiction and destroy themselves when taking them, that somebody who is sufficiently mature, who knows what they're getting into, and who has a strong, healthy support system, can experiment with drugs on a limited scale in order to I don't know, push further the bounds of their own enlightenment, something like that. Now, that's the argument that Raskolnikov used to justify his own murders. And it didn't work for him, but it does sometimes work for the druggy hippie types. And where does cucking fall into this? Because it's the same logic, but at the same time, the whole drug thing, that doesn't work all the time. So maybe it's the same thing with cucking. Maybe there's like a tiny minority of people in which it could be fun and positive. But I would wager a bet that those people for whom it would be fun and positive, they don't turn it into a fucking social movement, trying to normalize cucking among everyone, and they generally just keep it to themselves. They don't need to be out and proud about it, mainly because the personality type, they would probably have a healthy dose of humility. And pride and humility, those things, they don't go together. You could almost write a rule out of this, like, the positive cuck is someone who doesn't brag about it, or who doesn't publicly endorse it. Maybe it's something like that. And then you have to think, well, isn't that most sexuality? Like, I know it's an old axiom, but there was the whole don't kiss and tell thing. If you value your relationship, are you really going to let everyone else into the bedroom in any way? You might tell them anonymously online or something, but are you going to, like, go brag to your friends about it? I've always thought it to be kind of tacky whenever you watch, like, a teen movie or something, and the high schoolers getting laid at, like, a house party, and there's people on the other side of the door listening in and jeering on as they have sex. It just seems kind of, I don't know, disgusting in a sense. And this also sounds a lot to me like the most recent objections to the LGBTQ plus crowd. I don't think anybody in their right mind anymore actually has an objection to gay marriage, as long as it stays within the marriage, right? Like, if you see two gay men who get married and they keep their sex life in the bedroom and they maintain some kind of a nuclear family and they're a part of their community, I think any objections to that based solely on the fact that they're gay can be safely ignored at this point, maybe even as actual bigotry. But then you get the fact that, pride parades are getting more and more sexual and more wild every year. You get the whole drag queens twerking for kids at public libraries under police protection meme that was floating around a few months ago. Well, all those things have moved beyond personal interactions, haven't they? At that point, the objection isn't against being gay or against the LGBT community. It's against the making public of what should be private sexual conduct. And so maybe it's that. Maybe the problem with all of this, including cuckoldry, isn't the fact that it's happening. It's the fact that it's public and it's normalized. And I think, the cheekier people among us would actually say, well, things are more fun when they're taboo, so please don't normalize them, Gay sex was more fun when being gay was illegal, that sort of thing. I don't know how true that is, but there's at least some funny logic to it. So maybe that's where I'll leave this. Cuckoldry will only work for the people who are least likely to actually talk about it working. I think those people are an extreme minority, probably even less than like the trans minority, which is like, what, 0.1% or something? And so it would not be any of these open cucks that you see fluttering around the internet nowadays. For those guys, their life is probably in ruin. So in closing, does cuckoldry work? Probably in an extreme minority of cases. Should you try it? Probably not. I think you'd have to be a very special set of people for it to work out. And if you have to ask, you're not them. So if you're listening to this, doesn't really matter your gender, have some self-respect. If your partner asks for this particular fetish, you should probably say no. And if you don't, and your life completely falls apart, well, you should have seen it coming. In fact, now that you've watched this video, you have seen it coming, so don't be stupid, guys. Come on.